I thought it was the most divine meal I'd ever tasted. A flavor so pure it felt like a religious awakening. But 7 days later, my skin started to move. And when I finally crawled into that kitchen, I didn't find a chef. I found something the size of a truck, weeping for death in 1,000 human voices. The alleyway was a jagged crack in the city's concrete facade, a place where the streetlights flickered and died before they could touch the damp cobblestones. At the very end of this lightless cul-de-sac stood a heavy oak door, stripped of any sign or advertisement, its grain weeping under the weight of a century's worth of city grime. Samuel stood before it for a long minute, his fingers tracing the cold iron of the handle while the distant hum of traffic felt like a fading memory from another life. There was no bell to ring and no password to whisper, yet the latch clicked open with a heavy, inviting groan that seemed to resonate in the hollow of his chest. He stepped over the threshold, leaving the biting autumn wind behind, and surrendered himself to the oppressive silence of the source. Inside, the restaurant was an altar to shadow and stillness, where the corners of the room bled into an impenetrable obsidian. Samuel followed a narrow path between vacant tables, his footsteps swallowed by a carpet that felt as thick and damp as moss on a tombstone. The air was a suffocating tapestry of scents, a thick mixture of burnt rosin, cracked leather, and the cloying, medicinal sweetness of funeral lilies. Dust motes danced in the weak, amber glow of a single chandelier that hung like a dying sun from the ceiling. He found himself guided toward a solitary table at the far end of the hall, a place where the architecture of the room seemed to curve inward, isolating him from the world outside. He sat on a chair upholstered in velvet that felt unnervingly like human skin, cool and slightly pliant beneath his touch. The silence in the hall was not empty, it was a heavy, pressurized thing that hummed in his ears like a distant hive of bees. Somewhere to his left, hidden by a folding screen of dark wood, came the rhythmic, metallic scrape of a knife dragging against fine porcelain. It was a dry, clinical sound that set his teeth on edge, followed by a wet, muffled swallow that seemed far too loud in the cavernous space. Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the empty space before him, his pulse thudding a slow, erratic rhythm against his collarbone while he waited for a presence he could not yet see. A waiter appeared from the gloom, a figure so silent he might have been a trick of the flickering light, and placed a silver cloche upon the table. When the lid was lifted, the aroma hit Samuel like a physical blow, a scent so primal and rich it made his mouth water with a sudden, painful intensity. Resting in the center of the plate was a single portion of meat, a pale, translucent pink that caught the amber light and held it within its fibers. It was not still, the flesh gave a subtle, rhythmic twitch, a ghostly ripple that suggested the cells within were still firing with a desperate, lingering vitality. A thin, iridescent liquid pooled around the base of the cut, shimmering with the oily colors of a bruise on a fresh piece of fruit. Samuel reached for his fork, his hand trembling so violently that the silver clattered against the plate for a fleeting, discordant second. He sliced into the meat, finding no resistance as the blade glided through the fibers as if they were made of silk and warm fat. As the first morsel touched his tongue, it dissolved instantly, bypassing the need for mastication and coating his throat in a velvet warmth. The flavor was an impossible spectrum of sensations, a blend of iron, honey, and a deep, earthy musk that felt ancient and forbidden. His eyes closed involuntarily as the world outside the restaurant ceased to exist, reduced to the singular point of contact between the food and his own yielding flesh. Within heartbeats, a searing wave of heat erupted from the base of his spine and raced upward, turning his marrow into molten lead. A sharp, electric tension coiled in his lower abdomen, a throb of raw, carnal hunger that had nothing to do with the stomach and everything to do with the blood. His skin felt suddenly too tight, hypersensitive to the brush of his own clothing as a flush of heat stained his neck and cheeks. Samuel gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, as the euphoria crested over him like a breaking wave. His pupils dilated until the world became a blur of dark shapes and shimmering light, leaving him drowning in a sea of chemical bliss that felt like a spiritual awakening. Every sense he possessed was suddenly amplified to a terrifying degree, turning the quiet room into a symphony of hidden details. He could hear the slow, viscous drip of condensation sliding down the walls and the infinitesimal rustle of the waiter's breath from across the hall. Most prominent of all was the sound of his own breathing, a ragged, wet rasping that filled his ears with a rhythmic percussion. It was a beautiful, terrifying noise, the sound of a machine being pushed past its breaking point and finding a new, darker purpose. In that moment, Samuel knew he would never be able to return to the gray, tasteless life he had led before, for he had tasted the divine and found it dripping with a terrible, living heat. Samuel leaned his forehead against the cold, sweating surface of the bathroom mirror, his breath hitching in a throat that felt as narrow as a straw. The fluorescent light overhead flickered with a rhythmic, buzzing groan, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the small room and making the shadows in the corners pulse like a living throat. In the glass, a stranger stared back at him, a hollowed-out specter with skin the color of damp ash and curdled cream that seemed to hang loosely over a skeleton that had grown too large for its casing. His cheeks had collapsed into deep, bruised pits, and his collarbones protruded like jagged white handles beneath the thin fabric of his undershirt. Only his eyes remained vibrant, two burning coals of feverish amber that vibrated with a predatory, wide-eyed intensity, their pupils blown wide until the iris was nothing more than a thin, agonizing ring of gold. Every time he blinked, the sound of his eyelids sliding over his parched corneas was a wet, sandpaper rasp that echoed in the silence of his skull. The silence of the apartment had become a treacherous, suffocating weight, an ocean of stillness that amplified the smallest vibrations into a cacophony of violent intrusions. A single drop of water gathered at the tip of the rusted kitchen faucet, swelling until it grew heavy with the weight of gravity before plunging into the sink with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. Samuel flinched at the impact, a bolt of raw, electric agony shooting down his spine and settling in the small of his back, making his muscles twitch with involuntary spasms. He could hear the building breathing, the ancient timber of the floorboards groaning as the house settled in the cold night air, each creak sounding like the slow, methodical snapping of dry ribs. Even the wind pressing against the windowpane had a texture, a soft, persistent hushing sound that felt like thousands of invisible fingers tracing the glass, searching for a way into his sanctuary. He dragged himself toward the kitchen, his bare feet sticking to the linoleum with a series of soft, wet peels that made his stomach turn with a phantom memory of the restaurant. Hunger had evolved from a simple physical craving into a sentient, oily serpent that coiled around his internal organs, squeezing tighter with every hour that passed without the pink flesh. He opened the refrigerator, the hum of the cooling motor sounding like a low-pitched scream that vibrated through his jaw and made his molars ache. Inside, a half-empty carton of milk and a loaf of bread sat on the wire shelves, looking like props from a forgotten play, devoid of color or purpose. The smell of the bread wafted toward him, but it no longer held the comfort of grain. It smelled of ancient dust and suffocating cardboard, a dry, lifeless scent that made his mouth feel like it was filled with wood shavings. He forced himself to take a single slice of the bread, his fingers trembling so violently that he nearly dropped it onto the grime-streaked floor. As he brought the crust to his lips, his body recoiled with a violent, primal disgust, his throat closing up as if to prevent a poison from entering his system. He took a bite, but the bread felt like a mass of dry, flavorless insulation, refusing to break down no matter how hard he tried to produce a drop of saliva. The texture was an insult to his palate, a gritty, abrasive substance that scraped against the roof of his mouth and triggered a sudden, explosive wave of nausea. He spat the mass into the sink, his body convulsing as he dry-heaved over the porcelain, his vision swimming with dark spots as his heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. The shadows in the living room had begun to take on a new, terrifying consistency, appearing thick and viscous, like pools of spilled ink that refused to catch the light. Samuel sat on the edge of his sagging sofa, watching a patch of dark mold spread across the ceiling, its velvety filaments seeming to pulse in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The air in the apartment had grown heavy with a scent that shouldn't have been there, the cloying, medicinal sweetness of funeral lilies mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of warm copper. It was as if the walls themselves were beginning to sweat the essence of the source, exhaling the memory of the quivering meat until the very atmosphere felt slick against his feverish skin. He could no longer remember the scent of fresh rain or the simple aroma of coffee, for his entire sensory world had been colonized by the intoxicating perfume of the forbidden. As the evening deepened into a bruised, purple twilight, a new sensation began to resonate through the soles of his feet, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the deep subterranean belly of the city. It was a sound felt in the marrow of his bones rather than heard, a subterranean vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and settled in his chest like a heavy lead weight. The hum acted like a tuning fork for his nervous system, making his skin prickle with 1,000 invisible needles and causing a dull, throbbing ache to settle behind his eyes. Every time the frequency shifted, Samuel felt a surge of heat in his lower abdomen, a pulling sensation that tugged at his core like an invisible umbilical cord connected to the heart of the restaurant. His jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together until he could taste the faint, chalky dust of his own enamel, driven by a restlessness that threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. He moved to the window, his movements fluid and cautious, and peeled back the heavy drapes just enough to peer down at the street 3 stories below. The city was a maze of cold stone and flickering neon, but he began to notice figures moving through the gloom with a strange, liquid grace that set them apart from the shadows. They did not walk with the hurried, clattering steps of the healthy. Instead, they glided along the periphery of the light, their shoulders hunched and their heads tilted as if they were listening to a distant, beautiful melody. He watched a man in a tattered coat stop beneath a street lamp, his head snapping back to expose a neck that looked unnervingly long and thin in the artificial glare. The man's tongue darted out, licking his lips with a frantic, repetitive motion, his eyes reflecting the yellow light with a feral, glassy sheen before he melted back into the darkness. The entire neighborhood seemed to have fallen under the same collective, hypnotic spell, a silent congregation of the damned waiting for the signal to return to the altar. Samuel saw a woman standing perfectly still on the opposite corner, her hand resting against the cold brick of a tenement building as if she were feeling for a pulse within the masonry. There was a terrible, recognizable sameness to their silhouettes, the same sunken frames, the same feverish tilt of the chin, and the same agonizing focus directed toward the hidden alleyway at the end of the town. The wind shifted, carrying a faint, sweet rot that made Samuel's nostrils flare and his pulse race, a scent that promised a release from the gray, cardboard reality of his existence. He realized then that he was no longer an individual, but a single node in a vast, invisible network of hunger, bound to these strangers by a shared chemistry that defied the laws of the natural world. Time had long since dissolved into a series of agonizing peaks and valleys of sensory overload, leaving him adrift in a sea of shivering fits and cold sweats. He watched the hands of the wall clock crawl through the hours of the night, each tick sounding like a heavy iron bolt being slid into place, sealing him into his own misery. 7 o'clock passed in a blur of frantic pacing, his fingers digging into the palms of his hands until he drew thin, red lines of blood that he immediately tried to lick clean. 9 o'clock brought a fever that made the very air feel like it was composed of tiny, jagged shards of glass, making every breath a painful exercise in endurance. By 11 o'clock, he was huddled on the floor, his forehead pressed against the cold wood as he tried to ground himself against the mounting waves of euphoria and despair that threatened to drown his mind. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning on the 10th of November when the final barrier of his resistance finally crumbled into a fine, gray ash. The date felt heavy in his mind, a cold milestone whispered by the shadows and echoed by the rhythmic, wet thumping of his own heart. The hum from the city had reached a deafening crescendo, a roaring vibration that filled his skull and silenced every thought of morality, fear, or self-preservation. He stood up, his legs feeling heavy and powerful, his senses honed to a razor's edge that could perceive the infinitesimal vibrations of the air as it moved through the room. He did not need to check his reflection again, for he could feel the transformation in the way his blood moved, a slow, viscous crawl that felt exactly like the shimmering liquid pooling around a pink, translucent steak. Samuel reached for his coat, the fabric feeling like coarse, abrasive sandpaper against his hypersensitized skin, and stepped out into the hallway with a predatory silence. The elevator was a humming metal cage that felt far too small, the air inside smelling of old grease and cold electricity, forcing him to take shallow, rhythmic breaths. When he finally emerged into the night, the streetlights seemed to pulse with a dark, inviting life, casting long shadows that stretched out like pointing fingers toward the end of the city. He did not need to remember the way, for every cell in his body was acting as a compass needle, pulling him toward the source of the agony and the only possible cure for the fire in his veins. He walked with a fluid, effortless gait, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of his kin as he moved deeper into the throat of the city, toward the oak door and the weeping meat that waited for him in the dark. Samuel leaned his aching back against the rough, soot-stained brickwork of the restaurant's rear exterior, feeling the ancient masonry leach the feverish heat from his skin. The brick was uneven, some edges sharp enough to snag the thin fabric of his coat, others worn smooth by decades of neglect and city rot. Above him, the moon was a pale, cataract blind eye peering through the smog, but down here in the cul-de-sac, the darkness was absolute and heavy as wet wool. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through the wall itself, connecting his internal panic to the silent weight of the building. His fingers curled into the mortar, scraping against the grit as he tried to steady a breath that came in short, jagged gasps of freezing night air. A massive industrial ventilation unit jutted out from the wall like a rusted iron lung, its heavy metal blades churning with a low, mechanical growl that shook the very ground beneath his feet. It exhaled a thick, yellowish vapor into the night, a cloud of fat heavy steam that smelled of scorched marrow and ancient, cloying sweetness. As the mist curled around Samuel's face, it left a greasy, iridescent film upon his skin, a layer of atmospheric filth that felt unnervingly warm and slick to the touch. He watched the steam rise, obscuring the stars, turning the narrow slit of sky into a murky, jaundiced haze that seemed to suffocate the flickering streetlights in the distance. The sound of the fan was a constant, grinding drone, a mechanical heartbeat that masked the sound of his own movement while it worked to purge the secrets of the kitchen into the uncaring city. For hours, or perhaps what felt like days in his fractured perception, he had watched this threshold from the safety of the shadows across the street. He had seen the patrons arrive and depart in their trance-like states, but he had never seen a single delivery truck navigate the tight turn into the alleyway. There were no crates of produce, no hanging carcasses of beef, and no rattling vans filled with the mundane necessities of a functioning kitchen. The restaurant stood as a silent, autonomous monolith, a closed loop of consumption that appeared to require nothing from the outside world except for the bodies that crossed its threshold. This realization sat in his stomach like a cold stone, a logistical impossibility that defied the natural laws of commerce and suggested a far more terrible source of sustenance within. He began to edge along the foundation, his hands skimming the damp, moss-slick stone until he found a small, rectangular window set deep into the concrete. It was a service portal for the basement, partially obscured by a rusted iron grate that looked as though it had not been touched in 40 years. The glass was coated in layers of coal dust and dried rain, creating a translucent barrier that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic blue light from somewhere deep inside. Samuel knelt on the grimy pavement, his knees cracking with a sound like dry twigs, and began to work his fingers into the narrow gap between the frame and the masonry. The cold of the metal bit into his skin, but he barely felt it, his focus narrowed to the single, desperate need to see what lay beneath the dining room floor. With a sudden, violent heave that sent a bolt of agony through his wasted shoulders, the window frame gave way with a sickening, high-pitched crack. The sound was not the clean snap of wood, but a deep, resonant splintering that echoed through the alley like the breaking of a massive femur in the dead of night. Samuel froze, his chest heaving, waiting for the sound of approaching footsteps or the shrill blast of a whistle, but only the relentless groan of the ventilation unit answered him. A jagged shard of glass fell inward, shattering on the concrete floor below with a crystalline chime that seemed to hang in the stagnant air for an eternity. He stared into the yawning black rectangle he had created, a mouth of darkness exhaling a draft that smelled of bleach, old copper, and something far more organic and unsettling. He eased himself through the narrow opening, his coat snagging on a rusted nail with a sharp, tearing sound that felt like a laceration across his own skin. He dangled for a moment, his legs swinging in the lightless void of the basement, his feet searching for a purchase that was not there. When he finally let go, the drop was shorter than he expected, but the impact sent a jarring shock through his ankles that made his vision swim with jagged sparks of white light. He landed on a surface that was not the hard, dry concrete he had anticipated, but a floor covered in a thin, viscous layer of some unidentifiable slime. His boots made a wet, suction-like sound as he tried to find his balance, the floor gripping his soles with a persistent, adhesive hunger. The air inside was thick and pressurized, tasting of sharp ammonia that burned the delicate lining of his nostrils and brought involuntary tears to his eyes. Beneath the chemical sting was the heavy, cloying scent of raw copper, the unmistakable aroma of fresh blood that had been allowed to pool and thicken in the humid dark. It was a smell that felt heavy on the tongue, a metallic sweetness that triggered a frantic, rhythmic pulsing in Samuel's throat, making him swallow against a sudden surge of agonizing hunger. Every breath he took felt like inhaling a fine mist of salt and iron, a sensory assault that made his heart race with a mixture of terror and a dark, shameful anticipation. He stood in the absolute darkness, his hands out in front of him, feeling the humid weight of the room settle into his hair and clothes like a shroud. From the far end of a lightless corridor, a sound began to emerge from the mechanical hum, a rhythmic, wet percussion that froze the marrow in his bones. It was a heavy, deliberate sound, a fleshy impact followed by a lingering, suction-heavy peal, as if someone were slamming a massive slab of wet clay onto a stone table. Squelch. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of dripping liquid, a slow, metronomic patter of something thick hitting the floor. Pause. Squelch. It was the sound of labor, but not the labor of a human being. It had a weight and a wetness to it that suggested an immense volume of soft, saturated tissue being manipulated by heavy hands. Samuel's ears rang with the intensity of the noise, each impact vibrating in the hollow of his chest like a funeral drum. He began to move toward the sound, his hands brushing against the walls to guide his way through the suffocating gloom. The concrete beneath his fingertips was not the cold, dead surface of a basement, but felt strangely yielding and warm, as if the building itself were maintaining a steady internal temperature. As he moved deeper into the bowels of the restaurant, he felt a faint, low-frequency vibration through the brickwork, a rhythmic tremor that felt exactly like a massive, distant pulse. The walls were slick with a fine coating of condensation that felt more like sweat than water, a salty, oily moisture that clung to his palms and left a faint, luminescent trail behind his touch. He realized with a jolt of primal fear that he was no longer walking through an architectural structure, but was moving through the internal conduits of something vast and incomprehensibly alive. His fingers dipped into a recessed alcove where the wall felt particularly soft, and he pulled back with a hiss of revulsion as he felt the surface twitch beneath his touch. It was a subtle, undulating movement, a ripple of hidden musculature reacting to the intrusion of his cold fingers. The vibration was stronger here, a deep, resonant thrumming that he could feel in his teeth and in the small of his back, synchronized with the rhythmic slapping sound ahead. He wiped his hand on his trousers, but the warmth remained, a ghostly heat that seemed to seep through his skin and join the fever already raging in his blood. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling dipping low enough that he had to hunch his shoulders, the space beginning to feel like the narrowing throat of some great, subterranean beast. The blue light he had seen from the window grew stronger, a flickering, sickly luminescence that cast long, distorted shadows against the pulsing walls. It was the sterile glow of high-intensity ultraviolet lamps, designed to kill bacteria but here serving only to highlight the filth and the strange, organic textures of the hallway. In the flickering glare, Samuel could see that the floor was crisscrossed with narrow gutters, all of them overflowing with a dark, sluggish liquid that moved with a life of its own toward a central drain. The ammonia smell reached a crescendo, a suffocating wall of chemical fumes that made his head spin and his knees buckle, forcing him to lean against the vibrating wall for support. His vision began to blur, the blue light fracturing into 1,000 jagged needles of color that pierced his brain and heightened the frantic, predatory hunger screaming in his gut. The wet slapping sound was close now, echoing off the low ceiling with a clarity that stripped away any hope of a rational explanation. Squelch. This time, he heard a secondary sound, a wet, sucking gasp like air being forced through a saturated sponge, followed by a low, gargling vibration that felt like a groan. It was a sound of immense suffering, but one that had been repeated so many times it had become a mechanical, mindless process. Samuel rounded the final corner, his breath catching in a throat that felt like it was filled with dry sand, his eyes wide and burning in the ultraviolet glare. The corridor opened into a vast, vaulted chamber where the source of the sound, the smell, and the vibration finally converged into a singular, nightmare reality that shattered the last remnants of his sanity. He stood at the edge of the threshold, his body trembling so violently that his teeth began to chatter with a sound like dry dice in a cup. The chamber was filled with a thick, hanging mist that caught the blue light, turning the entire space into a surreal, underwater grotto of shifting shadows and wet, glistening surfaces. In the center of the room, a group of figures moved with a synchronized, mechanical grace, their long knives catching the flickering light as they worked in a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. Samuel watched as they leaned over a massive, undulating shape that occupied the majority of the floor, their hands disappearing into folds of pink, translucent tissue that looked exactly like the meal he had consumed 7 days prior. The sound of the knives slicing through the flesh was a soft, rhythmic hiss, followed by the heavy, wet impact of discarded trimmings hitting the floor with that familiar, soul-shattering squelch. Samuel emerged from the constriction of the throat-like corridor into an expanse so vast it seemed to defy the external dimensions of the building above. The transition was a violent assault on his senses, the absolute, velvet darkness of the hallway was instantly shattered by the piercing, artificial glare of 1,000 germicidal lamps. The light was a cold, clinical blue, a hue that felt like a needle pressed against the back of his retinas, bleaching the world of its natural warmth and leaving only jagged shadows and sickly neon highlights. The air here was colder, vibrating with the high-pitched, electric hum of the bulbs and the sharp, ozone tang of scorched oxygen. Samuel stood paralyzed in the doorway, his hand still resting on the vibrating wall, watching as the blue radiance danced across a floor that shimmered with a thin, unmoving layer of translucent fluid. In the center of this cathedral of sterile light lay a mass so immense it appeared at first glance to be a discarded pile of industrial waste. To Samuel's fractured mind, it looked like a mountain of pink fiberglass insulation, a heap of raw, fibrous material dumped by some careless construction crew into the heart of the basement. The texture was deceptive, a chaotic arrangement of soft-looking mounds and deep, shadowed crevices that seemed to absorb the blue light rather than reflect it. It occupied the space with the silent authority of a fallen monument, a truck-sized obstacle that forced the eye to struggle with its sheer scale. Samuel remained motionless, his chest tight and his throat constricted, waiting for his brain to categorize the impossible geometry of the thing before him. As the seconds bled into a singular, agonizing minute, the mountain began to move. It was not a shift in position, but a slow, rhythmic expansion, a tide of density that rose and fell with the agonizing deliberation of a geological event. Samuel felt the breath leave his lungs in a silent, jagged gasp as he realized the pink mass was not inanimate material, but a single, continuous expanse of living tissue. There were no limbs to ground it, no eyes to observe him, and no recognizable anatomy to offer a name to its existence. It was a landscape of skin, a convoluted topographical map of folds, ridges, and pits that stretched outward in every direction, slick with a fine, oily sheen that caught the blue light in a series of shimmering, wet highlights. Deep beneath the translucent surface of the skin, a network of veins as thick as industrial cables pulsed with a dark, sluggish rhythm. These vessels were a deep, bruised purple, branching out like the roots of an ancient tree or the deltas of a poisoned river, carrying some heavy, viscous fluid through the interior of the mass. Every time the creature expanded, these veins would bulge, turning the pink surface into a map of architectural agony, before receding back into the depths of the flesh. The sheer volume of the blood moving within was audible, a low-frequency thud that Samuel could feel in the soles of his feet, a subterranean heartbeat that seemed to dictate the rhythm of the entire room. It was a primordial sound, the heavy, wet thumping of a heart that had never known the constraint of bone or the limit of a natural lifespan. The sound of the creature's respiration was a wet, rhythmic whistle that echoed off the vaulted ceiling like the wind through a narrow cave. With every inhalation, the folds of the flesh would tighten, the pink tissue turning a pale, bloodless white as the air was sucked into hidden, internal chambers. The exhalation followed after a long, agonizing pause, a heavy, humid sigh that carried the scent of raw iron and cloying, floral rot toward the doorway where Samuel stood. The air was warm and saturated with a fine, invisible mist of biological vapor that settled on his face, tasting of salt and ancient copper. It was a breathing without lungs, a gasping without a mouth, a mechanical cycle of survival that seemed to have been happening for centuries in the cold, blue silence. Around the base of the living mountain, a series of narrow, stainless steel gutters had been etched into the concrete, each one overflowing with a dark, sluggish runoff. This liquid moved with a slow, hypnotic viscosity, trailing toward a central drain in the floor that gurgled with a sound like a drowning man trying to speak. The smell in the hall was a suffocating layer of chemical ammonia and the heavy, sweet scent of a slaughterhouse at high noon, a combination that made Samuel's stomach roll in a series of violent, acidic waves. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, his knuckles white and trembling, as he watched the blue light shimmer in the pools of waste that collected at his feet. The floor was not merely wet, it was saturated, the concrete having long since absorbed the essence of the thing it supported. It was then that he noticed the harvesters, figures that emerged from the deep shadows at the edge of the blue light like ghosts haunting a laboratory. There were 4 of them, dressed in heavy, one-piece rubber aprons that were stained a deep, permanent black by layers of oxidized blood. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency, their boots making no sound on the slick floor, their bodies hunched forward as if under the weight of an invisible yoke. Their faces were obscured by the angle of the lights, leaving only the pale, sweaty texture of their necks and the mechanical rigidity of their movements visible to Samuel. They did not speak, they did not look at one another, they simply existed as extensions of the room's grim purpose, a silent priesthood serving a god of raw meat. One of the harvesters stepped forward, his rubber-clad arms glistening as he reached for a long, serrated blade that hung from a magnetic rack near the creature's flank. The knife was a jagged, cruel instrument, its steel surface dulled by constant use but its edge maintained to a razor's sharpness. The men moved with a slow, ritualistic deliberation, testing the weight of the tool in a hand that was covered in a thick, translucent glove. Samuel watched, frozen by a morbid, hypnotic fascination, as the harvester approached a particularly swollen fold of the creature's flesh, a mound of pink tissue that pulsed with a frantic, localized vibration. The men did not hesitate, he placed his free hand against the warm, damp skin, his fingers sinking inches deep into the yielding surface as he prepared to strike. The sound of the blade entering the meat was an explosion of sensory horror, a high-pitched, tearing scream of metal against wet, resistant fibers. It was not a clean cut, the serrated edge had to saw through the dense, elastic layers of the organism, producing a sound like a wet sponge being ripped apart by a predator's teeth. A fine spray of dark, iridescent fluid erupted from the wound, coating the harvester's apron and splashing against the concrete with a heavy, rhythmic patter. The creature did not cry out, for it had no voice, but the entire mass underwent a violent, shuddering convulsion that sent a wave of motion through the room. The folds of skin rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond, the veins beneath bulging until they looked as though they would burst under the sudden, traumatic pressure. With a final, sickening wrench, the harvester a massive slab of the pink flesh, the piece falling into his waiting arms with a sound of heavy, saturated weight. It was the size of a man's torso, a quivering, translucent block of muscle and fat that still twitched with the remnants of its stolen life. The harvester turned away, carrying the prize toward a stainless steel table where the blue light made the meat look like a slab of glowing quartz. Samuel's mind flashed back to the restaurant, to the delicate, melting morsel he had consumed 7 days ago, and his body reacted with a sudden, violent surge of nausea. He realized with a soul-shattering clarity that the divinity he had tasted was nothing more than the extracted agony of this pulsating, nameless mountain. But the true horror began when the harvester moved away from the wound he had left behind. Samuel stared at the jagged, cavernous hole in the creature's side, expecting to see the hollow interior of a corpse, but instead, he witnessed a process of frantic, impossible reconstruction. From the edges of the raw, bleeding gap, hundreds of thin, pale pink fibers began to sprout like the roots of a fast-growing fungus. They reached out across the void, weaving themselves together with a wet, clicking sound that reminded Samuel of 1,000 needles working in a textile mill. The fibers knotted and tangled, forming a new layer of translucent skin that thickened and hardened even as he watched. Within seconds, the wound was gone, replaced by a smooth, unblemished mound of flesh that began to pulse with the same rhythmic heartbeat as the rest of the mass. The creature was a closed loop of eternal suffering, a biological engine designed to produce an infinite supply of itself. Every cut was a temporary void that the organism was compelled to fill, a frantic cycle of growth that ensured the harvesters would never run out of their sacred crop. It was a nightmare of biological efficiency, a thing that had been stripped of its soul and its shape until only the capacity for pain and regeneration remained. Samuel watched as a second harvester approached another section of the mass, his knife raised, the blue light glinting off the steel as the cycle began again. The sound of the sawing blade, the wet splash of the fluid, and the rhythmic, weaving hiss of the regenerating fibers formed a symphony of industrial slaughter that filled the cavernous hall. Samuel's legs finally gave way, and he slumped against the doorframe, his breath coming in shallow, sobbing hitches that he could not control. He looked at his own hands, the skin pale and gray in the ultraviolet light, and wondered how much of his own tissue had already been replaced by the fibers of the creature. He could feel a subtle, rhythmic twitching in the muscles of his thighs, a localized vibration that matched the pulse of the mountain in the center of the room. He was not a guest at a restaurant, he was a host for a parasite, a living extension of the pink mass that was currently being sliced and served in the world above. The hunger in his gut was no longer his own, it was the hunger of the creature, a desperate, chemical demand for its own flesh to be reunited with the whole. The blue lamps flickered for a moment, the hum deepening into a roar that seemed to vibrate through his very skull. In that brief fluctuation of light, the shadows of the harvester seemed to stretch and distort, their rubber-clad forms blending with the convoluted folds of the creature until they appeared to be part of the same monstrous entity. The realization settled over him like a burial shroud: this was the source, the beginning, and the end of all things in the city. There were no deliveries because there was no need for the outside world. The source provided everything, a self-sustaining altar of meat that would feed the hungry forever. As he watched the fibers of a new wound knit themselves back together, Samuel felt a cold, wet tear slide down his cheek, and for the first time, he heard a sound beneath the mechanical hum, a faint, human-like whimper that seemed to come from the very air he was breathing. Samuel retreated from the pulsating horizon of pink tissue, his heels sliding through the viscous film that coated the concrete floor with a rhythmic, wet suction. His senses were a frayed tangle of wires, sparking with every new horror, and in his desperation to escape the crushing gravity of the creature, his foot struck a discarded specimen jar shattered against the base of a steel support beam. The sound of the glass breaking was an obscenity in the sterile, humming silence, a sharp, crystalline snap that echoed through the vaulted basement like a gunshot in a cathedral. The jagged fragments ground against one another under his weight, producing a high-pitched, abrasive screech that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of his teeth. Samuel froze, his heart leaping into his throat, his breath held until his lungs burned with the pressure of trapped oxygen, his eyes darting toward the silent men in the rubber aprons. The harvesters did not falter, their bodies remaining locked in the same mechanical, stoic rhythm they had maintained since he first entered the chamber. They were silhouettes of industrial indifference, their long, serrated knives continuing to saw through the dense, elastic fibers of the mass with a repetitive, rhythmic hiss. One man leaned his entire weight into a particularly deep incision, his gloved hands disappearing into the steaming interior of the creature, pulling back a fresh slab of quivering meat that hit the metal prep table with a heavy, wet slap. They were oblivious to the intrusion, or perhaps they were simply too integrated into the machine of the restaurant to care for the accidental sounds of a trespasser. The blue light flickered across their stained shoulders, turning the splatters of old blood into patches of deep, iridescent black. But while the men remained oblivious, the mountain of flesh reacted with a sudden, localized tremor that sent a ripple of motion through every fold and ridge of its immense body. The rhythmic pulsing of the veins intensified, the dark purple vessels bulging beneath the translucent skin until they looked like a nest of agitated vipers struggling to break free. A low, hollow groan began to resonate from the depths of the mass, not a sound produced by vocal cords, but a vibration born from the friction of thousands of internal membranes rubbing together. It was a sound of shifting tectonic plates, a heavy, humid grumble that made the very air in the room feel thick and pressurized, pushing against Samuel's eardrums until they throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. Then came the sound that shattered the last remains of Samuel's rational mind, a sound that forced him to his knees as if the gravity of the room had suddenly tripled. It was a voice, but one stripped of all the singular characteristics of a person, a sound composed of thousands of layered, overlapping intonations that created a haunting, discordant harmony. It was thin and rattling, like the wind whistling through a dry ribcage, yet it carried a weight of exhaustion that felt as ancient as the city itself. There was no roar, no animalistic growl, only a soft, tremulous vibration that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to the nerves in his spine. The air in the chamber suddenly carried the texture of a dry, desperate exhale, a breath that had been held for 100 years and was finally being allowed to escape in a single, agonizing word. Please. The word was not spoken so much as it was wept, a suspension of sound that hung in the blue-lit mist like a physical weight. Within that single syllable, Samuel could hear the rasp of an old man's dying breath, the sharp, silver needle of a child's whimper, and the frantic, rhythmic sobbing of 1,000 women. It was a collective plea, a chorus of the damned that had been synthesized into a singular, vibrating entity. The sound was so saturated with sorrow that it felt like a cold liquid entering Samuel's brain, drenching his thoughts in a wave of hopeless, lightless despair. He gripped his head with both hands, his fingernails digging into his scalp, but he could not shut out the resonance of that voice, which seemed to be emanating from the very cells of his own body. Kill me. The second plea followed with the agonizing deliberation of a falling guillotine, a sound so hollow and devoid of hope that it made the surrounding machinery seem merciful by comparison. It was a command disguised as a prayer, a vibration that shook the jars on the distant shelves and caused the blue lamps to flicker in a frantic, staccato dance. As the voice faded, it left behind a lingering, metallic aftertaste on Samuel's tongue, a flavor of copper and salt that reminded him of the meal he had devoured with such shameful ecstasy. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a surge of nausea that sent him doubling over, his forehead inches from the slick, slime-covered concrete. The creature began to weep, but it had no eyes from which to shed tears. Instead, every pore across the vast, pink landscape of its body began to exude a clear, viscous liquid. The fluid bubbled up from beneath the skin, silver droplets that caught the blue light and shimmered like 1,000 tiny diamonds before merging into sluggish, heavy streams. These tears moved with a slow, hypnotic grace, tracing the topography of the folds and ridges, filling the deep crevices until the entire mass was encased in a shimmering, wet shroud. The scent changed instantly, the sharp ammonia and copper replaced by a cloying, floral sweetness that was so intense it felt like a physical intrusion into Samuel's lungs. It was the scent of concentrated grief, a perfume made of distilled misery that felt slick and oily against the back of his throat. Samuel realized then that the euphoria he had felt in the dining room, the electric heat in his veins and the divine expansion of his senses, was nothing more than a chemical byproduct of this creature's infinite suffering. The restaurant had found a way to process agony into a commodity, to harvest the very essence of a soul's desire for death and serve it on a porcelain plate for the pleasure of the city's elite. Every bite he had taken was a piece of this pleading mountain, a fragment of a being that was being eternally divided and consumed, yet remained forever whole. The ecstasy was a lie, a neurochemical mask worn by the horror to ensure its own continued cultivation, and the hunger he felt now was merely the creature's own desperation calling out to its stolen parts. In his state of collapse, Samuel found himself staring at the harvester closest to him, the man's heavy rubber boots just a few feet away from his face. From this low angle, the details of the man's appearance became terrifyingly clear, stripped of the mystery that the shadows had provided. The harvester's face was a smooth, featureless mask of pale, translucent skin that looked as though it had been stretched over a wooden frame. There were no eyes, no sockets, only a continuous, unbroken expanse of flesh that hummed with a faint, underlying vibration. Above where the brow should have been, the skin was taut and hairless, reflecting the flickering blue light with a dull, waxy sheen that made the man look more like a mannequin than a human being. The most horrific detail was the mouth, or what remained of it beneath the stretched skin. The harvester's lips had been pulled together and sealed with thick, coarse twine made of dark, unrefined hemp that looked as though it had been threaded through the flesh with a bone needle. The twine was stained a deep, earthy brown, crusted with layers of dried salt and old biological runoff, the knots tied with a brutal, functional precision. The flesh around the stitches was puckered and raw, a series of small, angry red welts that never seemed to heal, despite the obvious age of the work. It was a gag designed for eternity, a physical barrier that ensured the harvesters could never answer the creature's pleas, even if they still possessed the minds to do so. Samuel watched as the harvester reached for a fresh knife, his movements fluid and devoid of any hesitation, his hands moving with a grace that suggested he could perform this task in total darkness. The man's skin was the same color as the creature's, a pale, sickly pink that seemed to glow with a faint, internal luminescence. He realized that the harvesters were not employees, but were themselves extensions of the mass, drones birthed from the same regenerative soil to serve as the tools of its harvest. They were the hands of the monster, turned against its own body in a cannibalistic cycle that had no beginning and no end. The silence of the men was a heavy, suffocating blanket that magnified the creature's layered, weeping voice until the basement felt like a pressure cooker of sound and sorrow. The fluid from the creature's pores began to pool around Samuel's knees, a warm, thick tide that soaked through his trousers and clung to his skin with a persistent, adhesive heat. He could feel the liquid beginning to pulse in synchronization with the heartbeat of the room, a rhythmic throb that felt like 1,000 tiny mouths pressing against his legs. The scent of the lilies was so thick now that he could taste it in his sinuses, a cloying, wrought-heavy sweetness that made his head swim and his vision fracture into a kaleidoscope of blue and pink. He tried to crawl away, his hands slipping on the slick concrete, but the liquid seemed to follow him, a sentient ocean of tears that refused to let him go. The voice of the creature rose in a final, deafening crescendo, a wall of sound that felt as if it were trying to push the very walls of the basement outward. It was no longer a plea, but a pure, unadulterated vibration of pain that shattered the specimen jars on the shelves and caused the serrated knives to ring like tuning forks. The harvesters did not flinch, their eyeless heads remaining bowed as they continued their work, their knives sawing through the flesh with a mindless, industrial persistence. Samuel felt the vibration enter his chest, rattling his ribs and shaking his heart in its cage of bone, until he felt as though he were being disassembled from the inside out by the sheer force of the sound. He looked up at the ceiling, seeing the heavy, vibrating floorboards of the restaurant above, and imagined the diners sitting at their narrow tables, blissfully unaware of the ocean of tears beneath their feet. They were eating the screams, drinking the sorrow, and calling it a miracle of culinary art. He could almost hear the clink of their silver forks and the soft, satisfied sighs of their pleasure, a sharp, dissonant contrast to the weeping mountain that lay before him. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a crushing realization of his own complicity that made him want to rip the very skin from his bones. He had been a part of this, he had sought this out, and now he was being absorbed by the very horror he had craved. The creature's voice suddenly cut off, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a vacuum, a sudden drop in pressure that made Samuel's ears pop and his vision go dark for a flickering second. The only sound that remained was the rhythmic, wet squelch of the knives and the steady, metronomic drip of the tears hitting the gutters. The mountain of flesh settled back into its slow, expansionary pulse, the wounds from the knives already beginning to knit themselves back together with that frantic, weaving hiss. Samuel remained on the floor, a broken, trembling figure lost in the blue-lit gloom, his hands covered in the creature's tears and his mind haunted by thousands of voices that would never, ever be silent again. Samuel lunged into the dark throat of the exit corridor, his breath coming in ragged, wet heaves that rattled against the roof of his mouth. The walls felt narrower than before, the vibrating concrete pressing against his shoulders like the closing jaws of a stone trap. His fingers, slick with the creature's viscous tears and his own sweat, scraped frantically against the rough masonry as he stumbled forward into the gloom. He felt a sharp, crystalline agony as his fingernails caught in a jagged fissure of the wall, the tips tearing back and leaving dark, blooming stains on the gray stone, but the pain felt distant, muffled by the roaring of the blood in his ears. Every step was a desperate struggle against the suction of the slime-coated floor, his boots making a frantic, rhythmic slapping sound that echoed the mechanical harvesting he had left behind in the blue-lit chamber. He finally reached the window of the basement, hauling his wasted frame through the narrow opening with a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror. He tumbled onto the cold, damp cobblestones of the alleyway, the impact jarring his teeth and sending a fresh wave of nausea through his gut. Samuel lay there for a moment, his cheek pressed against the grime-streaked stone, gasping for air that should have been refreshing but instead felt like poison. The night air was thick with the city's exhaust and the smell of wet asphalt, but beneath it all, he could still taste the cloying sweetness of the funeral lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of the basement. He looked at his hands in the flickering light of a distant street lamp. They were pale, trembling things, stained with a dark, iridescent fluid that refused to be wiped away on his trousers. He forced himself to his feet, his joints clicking with a dry, hollow sound that seemed to resonate through his entire skeleton. He wanted to scream, to run until his lungs burst, to find a police station or a hospital and babble the truth until someone listened, but his body had its own agenda. His legs moved with a strange, liquid autonomy, carrying him out of the alley and toward the wide, empty expanse of the central square. He tried to resist, to turn his feet toward the main road where the late-night taxis hummed, but every attempt to deviate from the path was met with a sharp, electric spike of agony in his spine. It was as if his nervous system had been rewired, his muscles now serving a different master, pulling him toward the heart of the city with the steady, inexorable force of a tide. The city around him was a graveyard of gray stone and jaundiced light, but he could hear it now, the low-frequency hum that he had once thought was industrial noise. It wasn't the sound of machinery, it was the collective heartbeat of the thousands who had eaten at the source, a subterranean vibration that unified the buildings and the people into a single, pulsing organism. Samuel felt the hum vibrating in his own marrow, a rhythmic thrumming that matched the expansion and contraction of the mountain of flesh in the basement. Every cell in his body seemed to be singing in a low, discordant harmony, a vibration that made his skin itch and his eyes burn with a feverish intensity. He was no longer a man walking through a city, he was a single red blood cell moving through the veins of a vast, urban beast. In the silence of his mind, the weeping voice of the creature continued to echo, but the layered, discordant intonations had begun to simplify. The thousands of voices were merging, the sharp screams and soft whimpers coalescing into a singular, familiar timbre that made his blood run cold. It was his own voice, the exact pitch of his laughter, the specific rasp of his morning cough, the unique cadence of his inner thoughts. The plea for death was no longer coming from the pink mass in the basement, it was vibrating within the hollow of his own chest, rising from the depths of his own lungs. He clutched at his throat, his fingers meeting the cold, clammy skin of his neck, but he could not stop the sound of his own internal sobbing as it synchronized with the city's hum. Samuel stopped in front of a darkened shop window, the glass acting as a soot-stained mirror that reflected the flickering neon of a nearby pharmacy sign. He leaned in close, his breath fogging the glass in a thick, gray veil that smelled faintly of copper and rot. In the weak, strobe-like light, his reflection was a nightmare of hollows and shadows, his skin looking like wet parchment stretched over a frame of dry wood. His eyes were wide and glassy, the pupils fluctuating in size with every pulse of the subterranean vibration, their amber depths swirling with a dark, oily luminescence. He looked like a man who had been dead for 3 days, yet his body was vibrating with a terrifying, unnatural vitality that seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. As he watched, a small, rhythmic movement beneath the skin of his shoulder caught his eye, a subtle undulation that looked like a worm moving beneath a silk sheet. He watched, paralyzed by a cold, hypnotic fascination, as a small, rounded lump began to travel slowly across his collarbone, heading toward his neck. It moved with a smooth, fluid grace, a knot of new tissue that seemed to be searching for a place to settle. When it reached the base of his throat, it stopped, pulsing once with a heavy, wet throb before sinking back into the depths of his anatomy. Samuel realized then that the meat he had consumed was not being digested, it was being integrated, the regenerative fibers of the creature weaving themselves into his own muscles and organs like the roots of a parasitic vine. The horrifying truth settled over him with the weight of a burial shroud, cold and final. The restaurant was not a business, and it was not a cult, it was a reproductive strategy, a biological machine designed to broadcast the creature's essence across the entire population. Every person who had tasted the pink flesh had become a host, a remote limb of the central nucleus that lay weeping in the blue-lit basement. They were all part of the same meat, a vast, decentralized mountain of suffering that stretched through every street and every apartment building in the city. The euphoria was the bait, the hook that ensured the seeds would be carried and planted, turning the citizens into a living crop that would eventually be harvested to feed the next generation of hosts. A sudden, violent surge of hunger erupted in Samuel's gut, a sensation so intense it felt like a physical tearing of his internal organs. It was not the hunger of a man for food, it was a chemical demand, a biological imperative for the source of his new existence. His mouth flooded with a thick, salty saliva that tasted of iron and honey, and his jaw began to ache with the need to grind against something soft and yielding. He turned away from the shop window, his movements no longer his own, his gait becoming slow, fluid, and predatory. The city lights seemed to dim, the shadows stretching out to greet him as he began the long, rhythmic walk back toward the end of the alleyway and the heavy oak door that waited in the dark. The streets felt different now, the architecture appearing organic and soft, the brickwork seeming to breathe with the same humid sigh as the ventilation unit. He passed other figures moving through the gloom, their faces pale and eyeless in his fractured perception, their silhouettes swaying in synchronization with the subterranean hum. They did not speak, but he could hear their voices in his head, the same weeping plea, the same internal sobbing that had become his own. They were all returning to the center, all drawn by the same magnetic pull of the nucleus, a silent congregation of the harvest heading home to be culled. Samuel felt a dark, shameful relief as he approached the cul-de-sac, the familiar scent of the funeral lilies rising to meet him like the embrace of a long-lost lover. He reached the heavy oak door and placed his hand against the cold iron of the latch, feeling the vibration of the building through his palm. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of November, a date that felt heavy and significant, as if it had been carved into his bones by a serrated blade. He knew that inside, the blue lamps were flickering, and the men with the sealed mouths were waiting with their long, sharp knives. He knew that his flesh was now mature, the fibers woven tight and rich with the concentrated agony of his past week. He would be led to the stainless steel tables, and he would contribute his own quivering weight to the mountain, his tissues destined to be served on porcelain plates to the next wave of hungry, ecstatic guests. As the latch clicked open with a heavy, inviting groan, Samuel stepped back into the warmth and the cloying sweetness of the source. He followed the path through the shadows, his feet finding the thick, mossy carpet with an instinctive ease, his mind already drifting into the collective dream of the organism. The hunger in his gut began to subside, replaced by a dull, throbbing anticipation that felt like a spiritual homecoming. He found his way to the basement stairs, descending into the blue light where the rhythmic squelch of the knives was the only music that mattered. In the silence of his skull, beneath the roar of the city's heart, a new thought began to take shape, a final, wet request that he shared with every fiber of his being. He lay down on the cold, vibrating concrete near the base of the pink mountain, his body already beginning to ripple with the same topographical folds as the creature. He could feel the harvesters approaching, their rubber aprons rustling with a sound like dry leaves, their knives catching the ultraviolet glare as they prepared for the midnight cull. Samuel closed his eyes, his breath hitching in a final, human sob before the transformation took him fully. In the dark behind his eyelids, he saw the thousands of faces he had heard in the voice, and he joined them, his own internal plea rising into the humid air of the chamber. Please, he thought, the word vibrating through the silver tears that began to leak from his pores. Kill me, he whispered in the silence of his soul, as the first blade began its long, rhythmic saw through his yielding flesh.